Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. My name is Christina Giordano. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices, where we believe in a psychologically safe workplace. We know that the pandemic has really disproportionately impacted women, and there are a lot of layers to this conversation. Just to start, 70% of healthcare workers and first responders are women, while 28% is the gender pay gap in the healthcare sector, which is significantly higher than the average gender pay gap in other fields. Also, 40% of mothers with kids under 12 years old have reported food insecurity since the start of the pandemic. Today, we're discussing how companies, policymakers, and individuals can really help women mitigate these setbacks. And we know that there's no silver bullet to solving this massive problem, but we want to provide just a couple tangible ways that we can really move the needle forward. So let's get started with our introductions of our amazing panelists. If you could share your name, pronouns, and maybe something that you are looking forward to before we dive in. Tina, I'll pass to you first.
Well, thank you, Christina. I'm Tina Tchen. I am president and CEO of Time's Up. We are the organization founded famously to combat sexual harassment, but we really work for safe, fair, dignified work for all. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And actually, what I'm looking forward to this amazing speech tonight by President Biden. He's previewed it with some amazing announcements, which we can get into, but it's just, I get chills when I say it, that image for the first time ever of a president of the United States standing in the well of Congress with two women, including a woman of color behind him. Unbelievably historic. So you can tell I'm a little excited today.
It's a great day. It's a good day. Sukhinder, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Sukhinder Singh Cassidy, pronouns she, her, hers. I am the founder and chairman of theBoardlist and a venture partner at A Cruz Diversified Capital Fund. And I am excited about Biden's announcement. I'm particularly excited about family leave being on the table for the first time with a president who's, only 100 days into his agenda making this a priority. Family leave at the federal level has been talked about for many, many, many years. So it's exciting to see it, on the docket so early as part of obviously a comprehensive plan.
Awesome. And Claire?
Hi, my name is Claire Schmidt. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the founder and CEO of AllVoices, which is an anonymous reporting platform for the workplace that helps people speak up about challenges that they're facing or even positive things. I'm also really excited about tonight. I'm excited about what's already been announced. I do hope that we get into that a bit. A lot of that is just incredibly historic. On a personal note, I'm very excited to fly. I haven't flown on an airplane in so long. And so once I'm vaccinated, I have some plans to travel. So I'm really personally excited about that.
Awesome. Well, that is exciting. I'm also excited for that as well. For folks who are joining, if you have a question, please write it in the chat on the right-hand side and we'll answer your questions there. But to start off, I would love to pass the first question to Tina about Time's Up. So Time's Up is committed to eliminating really the structural barriers that hold women back at work. A lot has happened. So the COVID-19 pandemic, the economic crisis, the national reckoning on racial justice. How has this really impacted your work?
Oh, well, thanks, Christina. I mean, you set it up a lot in your intro, to the panel of, what we've been seeing about the wage gap and women's experiences during the pandemic. But let me step back 1 minute. So Time's Up, folks may know, really famously started on the Golden Globes red carpet to combat sexual harassment, as reported, by the incredible reporting in the New York Times and the New Yorker magazine and Hollywood. But we quickly learned that this was not something just in Hollywood, right? This is in every industry, and AllVoices work has sort of demonstrated that too. We didn't have systems to confidentially report. We didn't have supports in companies. And so we still work for survivor justice, but we also imagine a world where it doesn't happen in the first place, right? We want to actually work for workplaces that means having ones that are safe and fair and equitable for all, which means having diverse workplaces, because we know if workplaces are diverse and they're inclusive, if you have women and LGBTQ and people of color and disabled workers up and down the wage scale, both in power and doing the work, that you will have a workplace that is more respectful. You will eliminate the toxic practices that so many people suffer from and that lead to sexual harassment. So that's why we're working on these structural barriers, which we have seen just explode in the last year. Now, look, let me be clear. These are things that many of us have worked on for a long time. As Sukhinder notes, the lack of paid leave in this country is a long-standing problem. We entered this pandemic as the only industrialized country, actually one of only 2 countries in the world that didn't have some form of national paid leave on the books when the pandemic started. We didn't even have paid sick leave, which meant 106 million workers at the start of this pandemic couldn't even take a day off when they got sick with COVID, right? That just demonstrates how we just didn't even have the basic structures in place to respond to this crisis, but then to recover from it and to build an economy that's really fair for everyone. And so, now we see, the structural barriers that have long been there just exacerbated. And it's doing things like setting us back. So, we know that 2 million women have left the workforce permanently, we fear, over the course of the last year. That means women's labor force participation in the United States is at its lowest level since the 1980s. So in a single year, we wiped out like 4 decades worth of progress. And one of the big reasons, and the reason why we're all so excited about caregiving, is one of the big reasons we think is the lack of caregiving, right? We don't have, affordable and accessible childcare. Half the country statistically lives in a childcare desert, meaning there's no access to affordable childcare centers or home-based care. So people have to travel and their kids have to travel in order to get to work. We don't have a system of home-based healthcare for the elderly. We're overinvested in nursing homes, which we now know from the pandemic are not safe. And we have underinvested for generations in home-based care, which is where people really want to be cared for. And yet, we have an exploding elderly population as baby boomers like myself, I'll admit, become older and age into that need. And 70% of us, after we cross 65 or at some point in our lives, going to need home health care supports. And we don't invest in caregivers. So caregivers are not part of the formal economy. They don't have the same wage and hour protections as most workers. We can get into that. There's a long history that goes back to slavery about why that's the case. And so we need a system that invests in fair wages for them and fair labor protections, because actually that's what's going to grow the supply as well that we all need for caregivers. So those are the structural issues that are embedded in keeping women out, and not just women, but men, low-wage men and women. I'm especially struck by the way this pandemic has hit Black and brown women. We did a survey in Time's Up, last fall that showed, that over half of women of color had less than $200 in their bank accounts. And this was last September. They had less than $200 in their bank account. They were struggling to figure out how to put food on the table, right, for their kids, how to make it through the next day. Fast forward to where we are now 6 months later, and how much worse I suspect all of their lives are if we don't invest in the things that we need and that they need to get back to work and get back to work in a way that's fair and equitable.
Absolutely. And caregiving is really important. And it's something that's part of the upcoming speech that's going to be given today by the president. It's part of the American Families Plan that was just released. It's a major part of it as well. Let's start talking about what the federal government is doing to address the caregiving crisis that folks may not know about as well, and dig a little bit into what is offered into that package as well. Tina, I'll start with you again.
Yeah, so I think you got to look at one of the things that Biden folks have done very smartly is to build a comprehensive package. So it addresses all of those elements that I just talked about, which is actually unprecedented to see all of these things together as a package. So if we start with the jobs plan, which the president announced on March 31st, that makes a historic investment in rebuilding childcare centers, all right, in fair wages for caregivers. It makes a $400 billion investment in home health care that I talked about for the elderly. Unprecedented, never happened before. Then you add on to it today's announcement around the American Families Plan, which, makes another, $39 billion investment in childcare, and it invests in universal pre-K for all kids, 3 to 4, and doing it in a way that both supports Head Start, supports daycare centers, supports pre-K schooling. so that we can have integrated systems, all of it. So imagine a world where your kid could start out in daycare and then in the same place move into pre-K as they move forward to get ready for kindergarten. Like, how great would that be for folks? And it makes investments to build that up. And then, as Sukhinder points out, for the first time, we now have a proposal on the table to provide universal, in this country, paid leave. It's an extended 12-year plan to sort of work your way up, starting with, the most robust for, paid paternal and maternity leave at 12 weeks, but then scales up for folks, including family leave, including self-care leave. It includes bereavement leave if you lose a family member. It also includes leave if you are a survivor of sexual assault or domestic violence and need time off to go to court or to heal or to deal, with the court, the legal processes. And so it's really comprehensive and incredibly exciting to see.
Absolutely. A lot of exciting things are happening as well. And I also want to touch on companies, because companies are supposed to be microcosms of society. They involve a lot of employees and families, and really want to ask too how you see this manifesting in corporate America and how companies can really authentically show up for caregivers as well. And Sukhinder, I'll pass this question to you first.
Sure. Well, first of all, of course, as we talked about, so much of the focus over the last 24 hours has been on what the government plans to do. And that's really, really needed, particularly for the small business economy, where small businesses don't have access to, these resources, and federal support is really critical. And we know how many women, people of color, and in fact, how much of the workforce is employed by small businesses, which, as you know, themselves faced a crisis in the pandemic. So there's no doubt that you need federal support, particularly for small businesses. Now, let's think about what other things are possible. First of all, at the larger corporate level, I think that there has and needs to continue to be innovation in work practices. Look, the benefit of large organizations, quite frankly, is their investments in talent management are much larger, just given that they are profitable. We're experiencing, quite frankly, one of the largest tech economies of all time. So you have companies that are really, surging despite the macroeconomic conditions. And so in that battle for talent, people spend so much money on acquisition of talent and finding the best person, but don't put in place kind of the flexibility, that's needed for people to be able to thrive in a number of challenging family conditions. And I think if there's an opportunity post-COVID, it's that, while corporates have largely returned to normalcy, to be honest, and profits, there's an opportunity to take a lot of the flexibility that COVID has taught us is possible and create environments post-COVID that can really accommodate the type of situations that, COVID thrust us into, but beforehand we had nothing, to deal with that. So I actually look to larger companies to not wait for the government. They have, they are, in a battle for talent, yet I think maybe pre-COVID under-indexed on what was possible, and post-COVID realized a lot more is possible in terms of flexibility and not giving up productivity. So I have a lot of, expectations of how larger companies come back and use what COVID taught us about, people's productivity despite all these challenges, to make clear that more flexibility needs to be given, as well as obviously benefits for workers who are in caregiving situations. And they have both the profits and the means to do it. So I think that it is mostly a net opportunity for larger organizations to really adjust their work practices now faster post-COVID.
Absolutely. The profits and the means to build more inclusive and equitable workplaces. Claire, what are your kind of thoughts around that?
And flexible.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Sukhinder just said. I think all of that is incredibly important. And I think that because there's been this huge gap historically between what people needed and what the government was willing and able to do, some companies had kind of stepped up to fill that gap, but in very, haphazard, unpredictable ways. It hasn't been mandated in a lot of cases for companies to even have paid leave. The states have also stepped up in some cases to provide for paid leave, for example, disability leave, parental leave. So I think, taking a step back, when we think about what's happened over this past year, I think the pandemic has really crystallized where these huge gaps are in our economy, in our policies and systems, things that have not been working for a really long time. And we hear this all the time, actually, from our customers who are really HR people who are thinking about how to provide these policies to their employees. As Sukhinder mentioned, some of them are small businesses. They don't have the resources to say, take 6 months paid leave the way, a Netflix might be able to do. So we've been hearing about this for a long time. I think the pandemic has sort of given this opening. It's crystallized what's not working, and it's given an opening for government to step in. And I think it's really incredible what has been announced today, just because I think the government is sort of taking the lead, which has been needed for a long time, and we're behind so many other developed countries. And I think, to Sukhinder's point, hopefully that will also inspire companies to step up even beyond what's being sort of passed by the government, and to do more. So I think this is kind of a turning point in our country's history as it relates to creating systems that help working parents and caregivers and all kinds of people.
And Christina, I just wanted to jump in because Claire and Sukhinder's point about small businesses reminded me there are benefits already in place. So in the American Recovery Act that was already signed into law by President Biden, there are extensions of tax credits for employers of 500 employees or less who can give paid leave to their employees who are experiencing COVID or need to recover for COVID. And they've now expanded it. You can give your employees paid time off to get the vaccine and to recover from any vaccine related, recovery that they need to do. And you can get a tax credit from the federal government, to offset the wages that you have given your employees. That's in place and available now. And folks, can go to the IRS. We've actually at Time's Up have got resources to tell you how to access those benefits. But that's sort of, part of what I think the policies that the president is trying to put forward aren't just as mandates, but are trying to actually help especially small business owners actually implement these things.
Christina, thanks, Tina. One other point I wanted to make, which maybe segues off another point Claire made. We were chatting about what companies can do, both of us were. I do want to point out that there's one other kind of macro shift in trend besides COVID to the negative, COVID to the positive in terms of sort of creating a whole new way to work, as the opportunity, particularly for companies of all sizes, whether assisted by the government or on their own. But the one other macro trend I think that's worth pointing out, we all know it, is employee activism. Obviously Claire is sitting on a platform that does employee activism. I see this all the time, that Time's Up is obviously another form of activism. And I would just note that what we're starting to see at larger companies and smaller ones, but certainly larger, is kind of just just macro surge in employee activism about what they expect from their workplaces and forums. And I don't think that's going away, whether you believe somebody should unionize or not, whatever. I just think this is another force where employees will start demanding more of a say in how they work.
No, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point in terms of employee activism. And also employees are having more vulnerable conversations about caregiving, about their circumstances from work from home, especially, the normal for everybody is not the same. It's different for you. It's different for me. And just having that conversation with your employer. Do you see now that we have been through this pandemic and it's kind of been an equalizer in a sense of, everyone is affected by it, that you can have more vulnerable conversations with your company around, caregiving and what you need in terms of benefits without fear of retaliation. And, it's a new workforce. Tina, I'll pass that to you first.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, I've seen, more and more employers and CEOs and leadership, recognizing, I think some of it does have to do with they were all home with their kids too, watching, couldn't just go off to the office and ignore what was happening at home. And they could see it in their workers, during Zooms as kids are coming in and out. And so I think there is an awareness. you've seen Wall Street Journal's reported on manufacturing companies that can't field a full day shift on their manufacturing floors because they're telling the Journal their workers have to stay home because of caregiving responsibilities. So, I do see that activism. I will tell you the thing I'm worried about, and this was just came from a piece in the Journal just a couple of days ago, that as we do this return to work, right, I think we've got to make sure that we are listening to our employees. And, there's like a move in the tech space right now. Sukhinder and Claire, you may have some thoughts on it, where I noticed that everybody quoted in this Journal article were all men, right? Male CEOs of tech companies talking about the importance of FaceTime in the office and how where they were going was going to be requiring everybody 100% to come back in. And then maybe they'd experiment after that they were missing that camaraderie and, whatever the creative flow was going to be. And that's a trend that I think we've really got to look at seriously and say that's not what's going to help folks. I think folks are going to think twice about doing an hour and a half commute in the Bay Area again, right? To get the FaceTime in the office. But at the same time, if you go to a hybrid model and have more flexibility, let's not do it in a way that will actually penalize the folks who will probably be predominantly women, who are going to take the flex time because they've got these demands, and, make FaceTime like a thing that it used to be on how you get your promotion. We know now from the pandemic, it isn't necessarily the most productive way, to get the work done. I think we got to make sure we're paying really close attention to how this return and reopening back up to work gets managed in a way that we don't lose folks and continue to lose folks along the way.
Yeah, I agree with Tina that is going to be the risk. The opportunity is that people have learned what's possible on an accelerated time frame in terms of flexible work, and the risk is that in a hybrid environment, if some people come back and some people aren't able to, is there an uneven playing field in a different way? I think there was one other thing that you noted, though, Christine, that I think is true. The vulnerability around people's conversations is an equalizer. As to Tina's point, like if you're a CEO, you're staying at home and, your kid or your dog or something is happening in and around you and you're trying to juggle this all at once and people see that. And so I think there's been an avenue for leaders to be vulnerable and be okay with it. I've heard a lot from CEOs who say, like, I sort of recognize it's okay to show up as human. And, and that is, again, I think a net positive. And I think these conversations that were previously taboo about what's going on at home, I think the world has changed because everybody can see what's going on with everybody else at home. Like there is no hiding. And there's, I don't know. So there's some basic humanity that has shown up in the workplace, both for, I think, leaders and the people they work with and manage. So I definitely see a change. And I'm curious because obviously, Claire, you are on a platform that records confidentially, obviously, what people want to tell you. But do you feel like the tone has changed where there is, a little bit more kind of humanity around this topic or not? I'm just curious.
Yeah, this is really interesting. This is something we've been thinking about and talking about for the past year internally at AllVoices, because I think to Tina and Sukhinder's points, there's a lot of conversation early in the pandemic about everyone's life is on display. Kids are wandering in and out of the Zoom frame. Like it is, in a sense, a great equalizer. But I do think what we saw at AllVoices was that as COVID hit and sort of took effect, there was a huge spike in usage of our platform. In part, I think because it felt riskier than ever to voice concerns or feedback about, the challenges of remote work, the challenges of being, home with kids, trying to supervise them, because the economy was in such a precarious place and people felt more worried, I think, than ever to lose their jobs. So it's interesting because you would think, and I think this is true, Sukhinder, as you mentioned, I'm sure leaders felt much more comfortable being vulnerable, but I think for more, less senior employees in particular, I think there was still a huge fear of speaking up and, saying, hey, I'm struggling too, at least directly to people. So
yes, that's an interesting trend. Again, you see the data much more than I do.
Yeah. And we just did a survey about employee feedback just last month to see if things have shifted over the past year. of 1,000 people. Mm-hmm. And actually 74% of the people we surveyed at all levels of the organization said they would be more inclined to share feedback with their employer if it could be truly anonymous. So I still think there's a hesitation there. And I think we're making strides, but I think we still have a long way to go.
Right. So you don't think that there'll be a net shift where people are more comfortable non-anonymously sharing these concerns? In some ways, it's sort of reverting back.
I think they sort of offset each other. I think in some cases or in some contexts, people do feel more comfortable. Like, oh, I've seen your kid on Zoom, so maybe I'll share this anecdote about my kid. But yeah. I still think it feels like a lot of risk is involved in sharing direct feedback.
It's so interesting to hear that, Claire, because it sort of actually validates something I've been concerned about and I've thought about, because we know sexual harassment doesn't go away when you're on Zoom, right? It happens in the chat. It can happen, we've heard of it, bosses calling their employee at like 3 a.m. to demand work because it's like they're just at home and there's no barrier anymore, right? There's no distinction. But I've also been concerned that it is also harder to report because you can't just actually sort of casually take that walk down the hallway to HR, and to go sit there with somebody and take your time and, read the body English and get comfortable. You have to actually reach out and schedule something or get on Zoom, which is so hard to have, a real connected conversation about something really hard. So that I've been concerned about that in your data. It's interesting to have that to kind of validates that concern about how hard the problems don't go away, but it makes some of the responses and solutions hard.
Yeah. And I think as companies start to think about, being hybrid or remote first or whatever these new models look like, there really needs to be consideration around creating safe spaces and safe channels for employees to speak up, and knowing that sometimes that distance actually makes it harder, to your point, Tina, for people to come forward and have those casual conversations. And also one thing I've heard is like the idea of the water cooler, like when the boss steps out into the office, there's a feeling in the air. There's a sense of what's happening and how things are going. And people have really been missing that lately. And that may not ever come back the way it once was. It might be that companies are exploring having some people in the office at certain times or having a drop-in model. And so I just think we need to think about solutions to this new problem that we may face when introducing, flexibility and remote work.
Absolutely. And when we are thinking about solutions, we're thinking about inclusive design and really behavioral changes. I know on our pre-call, we were talking about Time's Up released a study in March about how to incorporate those behavioral designs into the quote unquote ideal workplace. This relates to the gender pay gap, rethinking promotions and compensation, and what, the new world of work looks like. Can you talk a little bit about how companies can be super intentional and really take advantage of this moment to help not only women in the workplace, but really their employees and meet them where they are?
Oh, no, absolutely. Thanks, Christina. So this, in fact, predates the pandemic. We started this work and it's all open source. So people can go to our website, timesupnow.org, to sort of find, this material. But I'm really grateful we have an impact lab, which was actually funded and started but with a grant from Melinda Gates and Pivotal Ventures to do, path-breaking research, because there's actually not enough research in what works and what doesn't work and what design should look like. And one of the things we wanted to do was, instead of looking at unconscious bias training or some of the tools that we've long had, can we take the principles of behavioral design and, behavior change, tools, and apply those to some of the issues of gender inequity. And we used the pay gap as the first sort of test, item to take a look at. And our paper, From Ideal Worker to Ideal Workplace is the title, really lays out that for the last century, our workplaces have been organized around the concept of the ideal worker. Now, there's been a lot of research about that. And the ideal worker is, the worker who's always available, who devotes themselves completely to the job, who fits in, and is, well suited to be part of the club. I like, who does that sound like? I read a lot of white males. It's a model that was developed literally over a century ago. And yet today we still organize how we hire and how we schedule people and how we evaluate them for promotions with that ideal worker in mind. And so we worked in the behavioral design from Ideas 42 to put this paper together to look at those key stages of an employee experience that affect how much you get paid, from the time you get hired to how your work is scheduled and how available you are to pay and promotion, and applied issues of behavioral design to each of those to show if we just change some things, not trying to necessarily change attitudes, just change the way the design works, we can probably affect gender equity and pay. So one example quickly is things like paid leave, since we've been talking about that. So a lot of companies have paid leave. They may have 12 weeks of paid leave, for example, but it's not the default. It's like you got to go ask. And you don't necessarily get 12 weeks automatically. You ask and you say, and some people take 2 and some people take 4, and as a result, even though the leave is on the books, the manager is still looking to see, right, who's really taken 12 weeks, who's really dedicated to the job and only taking 2 weeks. If you flipped the design so that the default for when somebody has a life change in their family, both man and woman, that the default is you get 12 weeks of paid leave, and you've got to explain why you need less than paid 12 weeks. And a manager has to explain why did their staff take less than 12 weeks. You've now flipped it, right? You flipped the incentives without really, it's not a big unconscious bias training. It is just flip the design on how you're measuring things. And you will have a huge impact, I suspect, on the take-up of leave, on the ability of people to have that flexibility, therefore the ability of people, workers who are in their childbearing years to actually continue their promotion without getting negatively looked upon because they took the 12 weeks. And there's a whole series of those. We've actually some very practical things in the pay gap space. But what I'm excited about is I believe this is a real paradigm shift in an analytical framework. Right? Let's take a very different analytical framework to how to address these gender equity issues from this design way, which is not making value judgments about people's attitudes or trying to do unconscious bias training, but let's create design in our workplace and our policies and how we operate in a way that will foster equity and inclusion as opposed to actually inhibit it, which is the way the design works right now.
Well, Tina, I think you're saying a couple things that are particularly relevant, which I think, again, if you think you're in the mind frame of like, I'm in a company, what can I do? There is this sense, you see it when people negotiate pay. Well, they didn't ask. And so the judgment is, well, if you didn't negotiate for it, why should I give it to you? Which is a different lens or paradigm, to your point, which it does put sort of the stress on the ideal worker. What should the ideal worker have done? Right. Versus, so I really like your paradigm, because I think this notion that as a company, like, take away these things that are so subjective, where we're putting judgments on the ideal person would have done this or that. So that's sort of, right. I think that's sort of pretty critical. And I think you're pointing to it. Number 2, it is really hard to solve people's prejudices and biases, which is why policies and frameworks exist, because trying to sort of cure any of us of our unconscious bias is actually quite hard, right? And it makes people very nervous about their behaviors and so on. So I think frameworks and policies are a substitute for good intention when none of us are going to be perfect, right? So instead of this expectation to walk around being perfect in the workplace, yes, you have to try and mind your own biases and prejudices. But again, analytics sort of and frameworks abstract that away, right? They say, look, this is the standard. And the standard then doesn't leave any room for sort of, personal judgments about people in a way that is, I think, quite freeing. So what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me. The last point I'd note, though, and I think everybody knows this, we all want our companies to get there on their own. We all want them to be like, well, to your point, Christina, like, what can you do as a company now? One could argue you can use this opportunity to buy, use the best practices, use research that's available, use what some of the best and most admired companies in the world do as your own frameworks, like the best places to work. What do they do that you can emulate? Those are very simple things. But I would say there's one last thing, and I think this is sort of back to individual agency. Although we wish we wouldn't have to, it sometimes does still take one person who comes forth and puts the issue on the table, but not just for themselves, for everyone. And so I think there's this idea where companies do the right thing. And I would just acknowledge that in the world in which we all live, it unfortunately still behooves each of us, if we're living something, that we suspect others who are, in our workplaces are living too. Being the first to put it on the table and help a company find a framework is both something we fear, something that requires courage, but it still has tremendous yield. And so, unfortunately, I still feel like, all of us individually may still be the people who need to prompt for those frameworks to be created by sharing our personal story.
Well, no, you're absolutely right, Sukhinder. I mean, that's a lesson out of the birth of Time's Up, right? Which was only because of the power of individual voices, individual survivors speaking for the first time, speaking, a lot of, women in the entertainment industry whose only stock in trade is their image, right? And, what people think of them. That's that when you're a creative, that's what you're judged on, and putting that at risk, to make those statements, to make the change. And, hopefully, we're getting better at supporting people when they do speak out, and I will say anybody, whenever I'm speaking to a group, I think it's important to note if you're experiencing sexual harassment, the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is there to help you. You can, again, go to, our website, timesupnow.org, to get linked to the Legal Defense Fund, or directly to the National Women's Law Center website, which is nwlc.org. They administer the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund because we have legal experts, who do all of that work and make all of those decisions, and please reach out, for help. And, even if you're not sure, I mean, one of the things that happens in a lot of these circumstances is we're so conditioned to just endure things, or, and the system doesn't necessarily, and you probably see this, Claire, in the reporting, people write and they're not sure what happened, right? I think this happened to me, and the guy who was getting the job got like twice as much pay as me. He's like, was that gender discrimination or was it not, right? Was that really sexual harassment or was it not? There's a lot of that because we're so conditioned to ignore it and not to recognize it. If that's okay to ask those questions, right? Whether it's through like AllVoices, or also, if you think you've got a sexual harassment issue, it's okay to just wonder about that and contact the Legal Defense Fund to get that advice. It's there for that too.
Yeah, I would just add, one of the questions that we offer companies the ability to ask employees who are reporting through the platform is, why did you use AllVoices to report this, as opposed to just coming and telling someone? One of the biggest things we hear is actually people saying they weren't sure that what they were experiencing was worth reporting or was even a big enough issue to flag. And I think especially in the startup and tech world, where things are moving quickly, everyone's so busy, there's this fear of like, I don't want to bother someone. I don't want to, stick in the spokes, right? And that is really helpful actually for companies to know, because a lot of times they have a policy in place against whatever type of behavior is going on, but it maybe hasn't been communicated clearly enough or proactively enough. So that gives them a signal, hey, we need to actually remind people about, for example, bullying on Slack, that it's not tolerated here. And these are the types of things that count as bullying. So Tina, I think you're exactly right. There's so many reasons that people don't speak up, and we are trying to do our part. And I think there's many pieces to that solution. Another one is having someone external to your company, like the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, where you can actually talk to someone and find out more information about what's acceptable and what's not, and what's legal.
I think a lot of what we're talking about as well, in order to speak up, whether you're speaking up to an individual person, a company, a colleague as well, is having that element of feeling at least a little bit psychologically safe that you're going to be heard and you're going to be seen. And we've talked a little bit about, mechanisms, tools, and just that level of trust you need to have in place. But how do we ensure that women feel like safe, dignified, and like they are being treated fairly in the workplace as well? Claire, I'll pass to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but I do think there need to be multiple avenues or channels for people to speak up about issues. I think everyone's needs are different. Everyone's comfort level is different. And so whether it's AllVoices or some other tool, or, anonymous surveys, or a whistleblower hotline, or whatever it is, I think companies need to provide ways that work for different people, to share what's going on with them in real time, because only by getting that information can they start to take action. And I think what creates a culture of psychological safety in part is that positive feedback loop of people speaking up, companies listening, leaders listening, solutions being provided or created, and those solutions being communicated. That actually feeds people's trust in their companies and their ability to feel safe while they're at work. And maybe the next time that person speaks up, they don't have to do it anonymously. They're like, that went so well last time. I'm very comfortable talking to the person who, announced a new anti-retaliation policy as a result of my anonymous feedback. So I just think that's one of the biggest things we can do as companies and as leaders is listen. And listening looks different to all different types of employees.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Sukhinder.
Well, I think there are a couple of elements to listening, and then I think there are a couple of elements that Claire also identified, which is what happens, in taking action. I would just say, as somebody who's obviously been a CEO at a number of for-profit companies, one of the things I found most powerful as a leader, and it's simple and it's small, but it's really important, is when, obviously with permission, when somebody gives you a story that illustrates the thing that you want to teach the organization is safe to talk about, with permission from that person. It's about the leader sharing anonymously or what have you, the anecdote, the situation, and validating that it is okay and more than okay to talk about those things. And so I have always been amazed as a leader how much power comes from when someone shares something with you, whether it's a team did a good job, turning around and in a public forum going, by the way, I know that the UEX team stayed up, or the QA team stayed up all night to get this feature out. And validating that for the rest of the organization is both demonstrating what is valued, and if candor and safety is what you want to teach your organization, you have to actually physically value that and publicly value that. So I just would say as leaders, if any of you are in those situations, obviously ask permission, but being able to take something that someone is afraid to speak and they share with you, and sharing it further and giving it voice because you have the power to do so, and making it safe is part of what we can give to others that helps them tell us more. So I would just say there's even small magic in that. And then I just want to come to the other point. And again, this is why I'll say to people, think about micro actions, not just the big action. If somebody asks you for something, or puts out a situation and there's any number of responses, we often think, well, gosh, if I'm a leader and I agree with some of this, but not all of this, or, there's this binary between somebody told me and I do nothing because I can't do everything they want. I also believe equally that simple, small actions go a long way to making people feel heard. That's not to diminish the weight of everything somebody might say is an issue, but your willingness to tackle it, even incrementally, is progress. And so people want to see visible progress. And I think we often think of these things as binary. People ask me for all of this. I can't give them all of this. So I just going to say nothing. And I'm like, but maybe the right response, as I said, is to be validating, the pieces of the feedback that you can move on and action quickly, even if they're not the whole, because what you want to do is get that feedback loop going. And that feedback loop is about validating people's right to use their voice. And then, of course, the subject matter that they're identifying, what can you do to validate and bring quick action, even if it's a smaller action quickly. I think those are the types of things that really, really reinforce the feedback loop that Claire's talking about.
That's so important, Sukhinder, what you're pointing out. I mean, it's like tone at the top. That's what I tell people all the time, right? We talk about, I used to be a corporate litigator, so I used to advise people about tone at the top when we're going in to see the SEC, right, around fraud things. Well, guess what? On these issues, tone at the top is equally important, right? It is what sets the culture and sets the tone and empowers people and makes it safe. And, one of the things I think that's happened over the last year is I've talked to CEOs who are nervous about saying things like, look, racial justice, you know, you've been a white man and that's your environment. That's what you've lived with. You have like you're struggling right now to figure out exactly what to say. And I've had lots of CEOs tell me, like, I want to be part of the conversation, but I'm really worried about offending somebody. I really don't know what to say. You know, I'm not equipped with the language, and there's no reason, honestly, why they would have been equipped with it. This is not something we teach in school. This is not, if you're not in that culture, you don't know, how that culture is going to react or what the language is. But I still say, look, just show up. Be humble about what you don't know.
Exactly.
Right? Be some vulnerable about it. Do some work. There's like plenty of resources now. I mean, the one thing the last year has done is really expose. There's reading lists, and then Netflix has got a watch list. I mean, there's certainly lots of ways to do the work, but also go ahead and engage in it, right? Get help when you need to. Doesn't have to be help within the company, but don't not engage in it, right? Because to not engage, right,
is impossible. And I would just say, like, people often don't think this way, but I think the big job of a CEO, besides, of course, running a company, is CEOs are storytellers. So, like, part of your power is in what stories you amplify for your own organization and workforce and your customers, what stories you share in a meaningful way. All stories are not meant to be celebrated, unfortunately, right? But they are. If it's not your story and authentically not your story, that's okay. It's okay to say, this is something I've learned, by virtue of these interactions, right? And I think that's the power, to your point, in both humility, but being willing to even share a story. That's a way you demonstrate understanding.
Right.
But yeah, I understand why it feels scary for people, but these are the types of feedback loops that I think, if I'm at a company, I want to feel psychologically safe,
I think it can feel scary, but I would also argue that people definitely can tell whether you're being authentic or not, or whether you have the right intentions. And I think, to your point, Tina, as well, showing up includes everything that everybody just said in terms of active listening, doing the internal work with a capital W, and then acting on it as well, and being super dynamic and creating strategies for folks and being inclusive in the stories you tell and the policies you implement too. I definitely want to be mindful of everybody's time as well. And I want to ask too, for folks who are listening, is there, and this question is for everybody, but in your eyes, how the future of work is changing for women over the next 5 years? What do just individuals need to be aware of in order to be successful in the workplace, but also companies and, really anybody as well, just trends you're seeing in the future of work? And I'll pass to Tina first.
Well, I think the next 5 years can be truly transformative, right? And really shift how we define work, how we define what the workday is, how we define where it happens, how we, technology is a big piece of this too, because it's enabled more flexibility and it enables productivity to happen in a different way. We have a workforce, to Sukhinder's earlier point, of both workers and consumers who are demanding very different things, about their lives, about the companies that they buy goods and services from. So I think, if I'm talking to a CEO, I'm saying recognize you are in a transformative moment. This is not like a return to organizing your workplace the way you did 5 years ago or the way you even did a year ago. And your ability to attract talent and retain it and to compete in a global market, right? In an increasingly global market where we've got countries that actually support caregiving, right? So that a company isn't assuming those costs, supports paid leave. So companies aren't assuming those costs. Your ability to compete in that really depends on how we transform the American economy to place us in a better spot. So this really does require thinking imaginatively, making investments in your workforce. The final thing I say is I've kept saying, in this knowledge-based economy, your investment in your workforce is as important as the investment in the latest piece of machinery, right? The latest piece of technology, all of those capital investments that we're used to making and taking a long view of. We got to take that long view of our investments in our employees, because that's your talent. That is where, in a knowledge economy, your productivity is going to come from, your competitive edge is going to come from. So it requires a really fundamental reorientation to our thinking.
I can jump in on this question too. I think to Tina's point, actually to a lot of Tina's points, but one thing we've been talking about and thinking about a lot is, the acceleration of trends that people previously thought would take 5, 10, 15, 20 years to occur, whether it's companies enabling people to work remote or have flexible schedules, adoption of new technologies, Slack and Zoom and all of these things that have helped us be productive while we have been all spread out and separated. I think those have all accelerated, and a lot of those changes are permanent, right? Even when we can go back to work to an office, I think Slack will still be something that's used, for example, by a lot more companies than were using it previously. So like new technologies and adoption and acceleration of trends is one thing. I also think to Sukhinder's point earlier and what Tina just said as well, employees, I think, and I say this all the time, I think there was sort of a shift change that happened with the Me Too movement, where before like the Harvey Weinstein news came out and there was this sort of like tidal wave of people speaking up about abuses that they'd experienced in the workplace. I think it had previously been seen as sort of acceptable for companies to just, in response to that, say, well, we had no idea that was happening, and to be completely absolved of any kind of accountability or responsibility. And I think what changed with the Me Too movement and organizations like Time's Up kind of stepping up and perpetuating these changes was that was no longer an excuse. And companies can no longer just say, well, sorry, we didn't know, and be completely off the hook. I think people are demanding more. Employees are more active and more engaged. They have more channels, right? They have more avenues to speak up. Like they can go to the press, they can go on social media. We saw this happen again in 2020 with, the death of George Floyd, I should say the murder of George Floyd, and the kind of racial justice movement that happened where companies were posting black squares in solidarity, but then employees were raising their hands and saying, I'm sorry, but behind the scenes, this company's actions and policies and practices do not match what they're saying publicly. And there was a way for them to voice that and to be heard and listened to. And I just think that type of accountability is here to stay. So companies need to really start doing the work and thinking about what they need to do to get ahead of those types of issues, to be socially responsible, and to be responsive to employees, because I just don't think that trend is going away.
And just to finish up here, I think so many good things have been said, so I don't want to repeat them. I would just note that when we think about the future of work, two things are true. There's been sort of the acceleration of these tailwinds that change what the landscape looks like for what's possible. But the other thing I'd note that's happened over the last 4 or 5 years, and we've seen it, I've seen it on board and diversity and inclusivity work, is it's not just things like data reporting that make things better and that kind of pressure. But let's be clear, like government pressure has worked. It's worked in areas like mandating gender diversity on boards. I think that as we see sort of legislation, and this is why I'm so excited about some of what Biden's presenting tonight. When I look at the future of work, I think we're going to see the confluence of three forces. Number one, I think we are going to see in this environment legislation that really drives the agenda and pushes the ball forward, where all of us wish there would be progress, but quite frankly, it's just not fast enough. Number two, I think we will see the acceleration of these work trends that have come from a macro environment where the world of work just fundamentally shifted with COVID, and nobody's going to return to the status quo because people have just been working a different way for the last year, and both what's difficult and what's possible. And so I think that will stay. And then I think you've got companies that obviously are feeling both opportunity, if you're riding high and, you're in a war for talent in a good way because you're just growing so fast, or pressure, whether it's, employee activism following societal activism and consumer activism and customer activism, and putting pressure on you to evolve. And so I do feel like the next 5 years are fundamentally, because all three of those things are mobilizing, right? There's a change from COVID, there's activism. If you're not getting there fast enough on your own, or, you somehow are enlightened because, because you're in a good place and growing and kind of feeling like you can do these things. And as I said, governments, state, local, regional, federal, stepping in to push the ball forward faster than companies are willing to. So it's going to be different because these three forces are kind of moving in confluence.
Absolutely. I think we're at a major opportunity to create flexible, equitable, and a workplace, whether it's hybrid, remote, or in person, whatever the future looks like, where employees feel safe and dignified in their jobs, which they should. And employees' voices definitely matter as well. I definitely want to take the time to thank our viewers for watching this webinar discussion, and of course our partner at Time's Up for co-hosting this event with us, and of course all of our amazing panelists for taking the time to discuss this massive topic with us here today. So thank you.